Hi, my name's Andy Schoepf. I work with the Lee Agency in Muscatine, Iowa. We're an independent insurance agency, and a number of you, if you're watching this, you probably know of us somehow. Otherwise, I'm not sure how you got the video. But anyway, wanted to just provide you with an education experience that we've done a number of times at different association events across the different Midwest states, but wanted to be able to provide it to you to utilize in your specific organization. There's a couple different purposes that I want this to provide for you, and maybe you'll find others as well. If so, great. But first off is a training tool for you. As I've met with a number of you in regard to emergency preparedness, it's become very evident that a lot of you are struggling with how do we train our staff? How do we keep them up to speed on these tools that we've created, these emergency plans, these policies and procedures that we've created? How do we get the new people up to speed? There's enough going on with trying to update your plans and then educate on those. But then initially, how do we provide that education, give them a general background and an understanding of what this is and why we're doing it? So that's one of the reasons that we're doing this education for you today. Secondly is to give you an idea of, or to be able to provide them an idea of what your structure is. How have you created your plans? Why did you do it the way you did? What's some of the terminology that you're using so that you can standardize that among your staff? And then lastly, give you some insight into what other organizations are doing as well. What are some of the best practices that we're seeing? How are organizations taking this difficult and complex idea of creating a bunch of emergency plans and then combining it with the idea of we need to create something that's simple and practical in order to be an actual functional tool in the event of an emergency. So really, again, it's creating an idea or helping you to identify how can we better take this complex idea, make it simple and practical. So just to review a quick agenda with you, again, as I mentioned, we're going to cover a brief history of what the CMS regulation is, why they created it. We're also going to review where we're at now. As I go out and visit with a number of your organizations, what are the trends that I'm seeing? How do you compare with others like you? Thirdly, I'm going to touch on why is this important. This is a big deal from an insurance standpoint. I'm going to help you understand why that's important. And then lastly, what do we do now? How do we create next steps or how do we take next steps in this process of preparing for these events? So first off, we're going to touch on a brief history. There's been significant pressure from both state and federal government regarding emergency preparedness for senior living organizations. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's what's going on. They are viewing the industry in general as being poorly prepared for emergency events. We're going to touch on a couple reasons why that's become an even bigger issue in just a minute. But CMS introduced this regulation back in, I think, early 2016 was when I heard about it. The requirement was that you be in compliance with this new regulation by November of 2017. So remember that November 2017 date. When we look at some stories or some things that have happened in that time frame, there's a couple things that come to mind, and most of you are going to be aware of these. If you're newer to your organization, you may not be aware. But there's a couple stories or a couple incidents that happened actually in 2017. The bottom one here, in August of 2017, there was some flooding from Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas. There was a picture that went viral online that showed assisted living residents up to their waist in water. They were sitting in chairs in like this living room atmosphere in an assisted living in Houston in flood water up to their waist. Not a good idea, not a good thing to have on the news. They didn't evacuate. They failed to have an evacuation plan that got them out of the building in time so that they could avoid that issue. The other one, this was a little bit more dire. Nobody was injured in the one in Houston that I'm aware of. But September then, 2017, so a month later, There's a nursing home in Florida where 8 people died after Hurricane Irma came through due to lack of power and air conditioning. It was overheating, water, a number of issues that shouldn't happen had they been prepared. There was a hospital nearby that said we could have taken those residents had they asked for help. So there are a number of issues that happened there. So all this is going on at the time that CMS is pushing this regulation. And you were required to be in compliance again by that November 2017 date. There's 5 primary components to this CMS regulation. One is the creation of an emergency operations plan. That is a huge issue, a huge task in and of itself. It's one bullet point, but it's a big deal. What does that even mean? Trying to wrap our heads around that was step number 1. Secondly, creating policies and procedures for any events that may happen. Again, a big issue, complex, overwhelming for a lot of you. Thirdly, communication plan. How are you going to communicate with residents? How will you communicate with families? How will you communicate with local authorities, with your county emergency management coalition or organizations, or whatever region you may be a part of? How are you going to get that information out? What if your internet goes down? What if your phones are down? What if cell phones don't work, or whatever your primary methods of communication are? How are you going to get that word out in those instances? Fourthly is training and testing. How are you going to tell your employees what's expected of them and train them on your existing policies and procedures? And then also testing your plan. This has also been one that we've been involved with quite often, and if you need help on any of that from a testing standpoint, there's specifically 2 things that are required. One is that you have to have at least an annual full-scale exercise. And by the way, if you have a real event, so for example, if you've had a winter storm come through your area and it prevented staff from getting in on their scheduled shift, if you document that properly, that can count as your full-scale exercise. If you had, let's say, a flu outbreak, or if you had a water main break, and you had a boil order for a period of time. These are just a number of things that have happened to clients of ours off the top of my head. Those can all count as exercises if documented appropriately. Then the requirement, CMS says you have to have a second exercise, which can be a tabletop exercise. So it doesn't have to be the full-scale exercise. It can be a tabletop exercise. We've actually created a few of these events. You'll be able to get them on a website, or call us, call your producer, whoever you need to reach out to from Lee Agency. We can get you some of those resources. But if you have ideas, if you have, hey, we'd want to test this, or whatever that might be, feel free to reach out to us in those too. We're always looking for ways to develop more tools for you. Lastly, the regulation talks about emergency power requirements. We don't really get into that a whole lot. I don't understand that side of it. We're not really going to touch on that component in this presentation. So where are we now? As I've visited with a number of organizations, again, across the Midwest, this is just some feedback to describe where I would see the industry in general. Most organizations have a documented emergency plan in place that, for the most part, meets the requirements of CMS. However, those plans I would not consider practical. When organizations are doing their training and testing, for example, very rarely are they pulling out those policies and actually utilizing them when they do a test. That tells me the plans aren't practical. A lot of organizations have multiple sets of plans. They've got a group of, or a set that deals with maybe resident care, and then they've got their building maintenance people have another set that deals with building. They may have transportation policies somewhere else. They may call them different things. So I've seen an organization have all of these separately. They had an emergency operations plan, they had a business continuity plan, they had a disaster plan, they had an immediate actions guide, and they also had an incident command system. They had all these different things, but they weren't consolidated into one cohesive plan. That led to confusion about how everything fits together, and I have seen a lot of that. Just how do we take all these different components, make it work in a practical emergency plan. And lastly, there's been some difficulty training staff on practical applications, again, because of new staff, because policies and procedures are so in-depth and so detailed. Lots of issues in that regard. I would be missing an opportunity, and as an insurance agent, we specialize in working with property liability, specifically the general and professional liability is the component that's impacted by your policies and procedures. I would be missing an opportunity to express the importance of this element. This is why I'm involved in your emergency plans in this process. The first reason, and just kind of start off with a positive here, having a consistent message, showing your people that, hey, we are committed to being around and handling an emergency scenario well. We want to do that. It sends a good message to families, it sends a good message to residents, potential residents, to staff. You are telling your people that your organization is about providing care for people who need it. Having an emergency plan in place promotes that clear and consistent culture, that clear and consistent message. But secondly, it avoids the negative consequences of not being prepared, and that's really where we come in. That's what we unfortunately see time and time again, is what happens when somebody's not prepared. You are being required to have, by regulation, you are being required to create more policies and procedures. These policies and procedures lead to more risk. What's happening is that plaintiff attorneys are being trained on how to utilize your policies and procedures against you. There's a strategy called the reptile strategy. There's books about it, there's all kinds of information about it, but plaintiff attorneys are being trained on how to, if an incident happens, if a resident is injured, if something happens, they ask for your policies and procedures. They're going to look through those policies and procedures to try to find where you deviated from what you said you were going to do. So you created a standard of care that you should have done. You know, that's what a policy and procedure is. It's saying we should do this. If this happens, we should do this. And if you didn't do that, if you didn't follow that, and somebody was injured, they're not going to pin that on you. So this is a big deal. More policies and procedures creates the potential for more risk, specifically more risk of litigation. More risk in general is not a good thing. Some risk is good. This is not the good kind of risk. So we're wanting to help you avoid that. The moral of the story here is that if you have policies and procedures, you need to use them. If you're not using them, you need to decide whether or not you should have them. So again, our goal is to come in and help you make this a practical and usable process. The standard rule of defense: it's better to not have a rule than to have a rule and not follow it. All right, so now what? Now what are we going to do? We understand what the rule is. We understand why it's important. Now what? Where do we go from here? My recommendation is that the first thing you need to do is forget the rule and let's think practically. Again, we're trying to marry this rule, this requirement for more policies and procedures with how things happen practically. So let's forget the rule. Let's set that aside for a second and let's think practically. What happens in a real life emergency event? What happens in your organization? Most organizations respond to me when asked that question. They respond, people step up, they lead, they make decisions, and they move on. They do what they believe is best in the moment, and they move on, right? They make decisions, they get things done, and it just happens. So real people are understanding, they're assessing the situation, they're making a judgment based on what they see, they're making, then they're acting on that decision. So how do we create, and this is where a lot of the emergency management organizations around the country have gone away from creating specific policies and procedures and more toward decision-based training. Allowing people to make decisions in crisis, to give them resources and tools to help them make decisions, but allowing them to make the best decisions they can in that crisis moment and then move on. So the question is, how do we create plans and training around the concept of allowing people to do what they do? The second component, or the second thing that we need to address is defining what are your capabilities. And we need to spend a little bit of time even on what does that mean. So I've got some words over here, some phrases over here that when I do this education live, we'll come up with this list as a group. But wanted to just think through this for a moment. So when you think of capabilities, and we're going to back up for a moment, one of the things that CMS requires is to have a hazard assessment. So if you have a hazard assessment, typically what you do is you list out a whole bunch of events, and then you rank those events based on their likelihood of occurring and how bad they would be if they occurred, right? So the frequency and the severity of those incidents happening. But we typically fail to go the next step. So when we do a hazard assessment, we're creating a list of events, right? Events such as tornadoes, fire, flood, earthquake, blizzard, cyber attack, zombie apocalypse is on a lot of the assessments that I've seen. I don't know who put that on there, but it's weird. Anyway, you typically come up with a list of events. Then you rank these according to what you believe the probability to be. And as you work with your community, if they have some insight, like you may not know if you're on a fault line, but your county says you are, so you have to increase that or whatever it might be. You rank these based on the frequency, the likelihood, and then also how badly they would hurt you if they happened, right? That's a typical hazard assessment. What I'm saying when we think about capabilities is we need to go a couple steps further. The next step would be identifying how each of these events will impact you. So we just took tornadoes here for an example. We said, all right, how would a tornado impact your organization? Here's a list of things I commonly hear. We've got staff shortages. We've got resident injuries, loss of refrigeration, fuel shortage, power outage. Volunteers may be needed. They may show up. What do we do with them? How are we going to communicate with families? So family communication may be an issue. Increased cost of construction. We've got building damage. We've got evacuation may be necessary. Transportation issues, public relations issues, right? There's a lot of different ways that a tornado would impact you. Now let's think for a second. How would a fire impact your organization? Potential staff shortage, resident injuries, loss of refrigeration, potentially, depending on where the fire is, fuel shortage, maybe, maybe not, power outage, could be, volunteers needed or showing up, could be, communication issues, building damage, evacuation potential, a lot of the same things. What about flood? Again, a lot of the same things. So we're creating some consistency. So now instead of thinking about having policies and procedures for each different event, we need to think about, okay, I'm starting to see a trend here. We can have some policies and procedures for a variety of impacts that are going to apply regardless of what the event is. That copy and paste function in Microsoft Word will become a very valuable tool to you. We're going to go one step further. When we talk about capabilities, that's the third layer. So we've got our events, we've got our impacts. Lastly, we've got our capabilities. So one thing here, Steve Flon from Vermeer Corporation in Iowa, in Pella, Iowa, presented this at one of our education events, our client education events. He said, emergency planning and business continuity is as easy as pie. People, infrastructure, and equipment that you can group all of the ways that you're impacted into 3 groupings. So those would really be his capabilities, right? People, infrastructure, and equipment. We could take all of these things right here, all of these impacts, and put them into one of those categories. I'm going to make an argument that that's probably not, that having that high level is really good from a conceptual standpoint and to help you think through what capabilities are. But when it comes down to dealing with specific issues, I think we may want a few more. So let's just look at this list and let's say, all right, we've got family communication and PR might be grouped together, all right? Maybe even what to do with volunteers or how to communicate with volunteers. All right, we've got evacuation, or let's say increased construction costs. Let's put a circle by these. Increased construction costs. We've got building damage. We've got fuel shortage, power outage, loss of refrigeration. Those are all dealing with your building, right? So maybe those would fit together. We have potentially resident injuries, evacuation. Transportation may fit in there as well, but really, how do we keep our residents safe? If you have maybe loss of refrigeration or food shortage, may fall into that category as well. And we've got staffing, maybe one all on its own, right? That might stand on its own. Transportation may fit in with our building. Who knows? You can organize that however you want. And then you come up with titles for each of these groupings. Okay? We're going to see how that's valuable here in a second. But you want to define your capabilities. What are the areas, what are the big umbrella areas that are impacted in your organization by a crisis or event, or a crisis event or an emergency event? Lastly, we need to talk about the concept of incident command. Incident command does a few different things. We're going to get into this in a little bit more here in a second. But it does a few different things. There's all kinds of resources, by the way. FEMA has some incident command training that'll give you a better idea on how they utilize it. But incident command is being utilized now from any first responder organization, whether it's your fire department, whether it's FEMA itself, Department of Homeland Security. All those organizations utilize incident command. The concept, the big idea of incident command is it's going to provide a clear chain of command. It's going to provide a delegation of responsibilities so people know who's responsible for what. Clear communication channels, communication flows up and down the chain very quickly and efficiently. And also it's a structure for organizing resources and tools. The problem, what emergency responders and what the emergency management organizations saw early on in the process was that by having a bunch of unique policies and procedures for each event, it didn't work. Because no 2 events were the same. You can't create a detailed list of step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 for every event that may happen. It's impossible. What you can do is create a structure around who's responsible for what capability, give them the tools and resources, questions to ask, checklists, expectations of what's required under each of those, and then let them go solve the problem. Let them utilize their own intellect. Let them utilize the resources that they have available to go solve the problem the best way they see fit. That's where emergency management has gone. Unfortunately, you are in the position where you have to have both policies and procedures and this practical side of handling crisis quickly. You got to take these two and kind of merge them. Incident command is really the best way to do that. So I'm gonna help you understand maybe how to take the impacts, the events, the impacts, and then your capabilities, and combine those with an incident command model. Somebody on our incident command team, wait for it. All right, we've got our incident command. This is our commander. right? And now we've got somebody who's in charge of staffing. Maybe we have another person in charge of resident safety. We have another person in charge of finance. We have another person in charge of public relations. We have another person in charge of your building. And maybe we include transportation in there as well. Okay? So the goal here, and most professionals would agree to keep this list to 5 to 7 or so. So each layer that you go down, you don't want to have more than 5 to 7 people responding to you. Otherwise it gets too confusing. You can't manage that many things at once. So if you need to get more detailed than this, go to another layer. So staffing can include, well, that's not probably a great example. Resident safety may include transportation, right? Do we evacuate or not? Do we, food and water might be in there. You might have medical supplies under there. And you have different people in charge of those components. The incident commander, whoever's designated in your policy to be the incident commander, and you need to have a few backup people in mind who are prepared to do this, but whoever's designated, their first priority is to assign these roles and responsibilities to fill out their incident command team, right? If somebody more capable comes along, so whoever starts as incident commander may not continue to be the incident commander depending on who else shows up. They may take another role and say, hey, you're more able to fill this role than I am. That's fine. Don't pigeonhole yourself into any specific people to fill these roles, because there may be somebody better that comes along, and then you can fill a role that better fits your abilities. But we're taking our capabilities and we're filling those in here in the incident command structure. So our policies and procedures then should refer to our incident command team. They should say at some point we have to implement our incident command team and then make whatever decisions are in the best interest of our organization at that point in time. But your incident command team functions then are broken down also by time. So you may have a structure on here or something that says, in fact, I've seen this be utilized in an immediate actions guide. Your immediate actions guide, it's kind of a flip chart. It says, hey, if a tornado happens, when you hear a warning, you shut doors, you pull blinds, here's what everybody should do and expect when a warning happens. You get to safety. That's the initial actions. That should all be done within a 5 to 10 minute period of when that thing happens, that warning happens. Fire, same thing. You have an initial actions guide. Can we put the fire out? Do we need to evacuate? Whatever it might be. But then there's a point at which it defers to incident command. That no longer then is part of your policy. It would refer to another section of your emergency operations plan that is incident command. It defines, here's what people's roles are, here are some checklists, but it's not going to say we're going to do this. If a tornado happens, we're going to do all of these things. No, we're going to refer, here's who's responsible, here's what they're responsible for, and here's a list of ideas for them to consider in order to accomplish that task, right? We're using the appendix of the plan. We're using a separate incident command function. We can have checklists. So your incident command team functions and actions are broken down by time. You're going to have those immediate actions. You're also going to have intermediate. So what are the decisions that need to be made? Let's say, from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and then extended 2 hours to 10 hours. And then maybe we've got a recovery component as well. So long term, what are the responsibilities of those individuals on that incident command team? By the way, there's a really good resource, and I'm going to get to this at the end. The California Association of Healthcare Facilities has an incident command team that's very thorough, very thought out, has all of those time components, and I'll have their website up here on the last slide. So feel free to go there and utilize it. It makes a lot of sense once you can see it practically as well. But this is what ties your policies and procedures to your incident command team. Your emergency operation plan includes resources and checklists then, we've talked about this a little bit, to assist the incident command team. These are not part of the policies and procedures. We want to keep those policies and procedures very short, very sweet, very purposeful, not a list of everything that we're going to do. The policies and procedures need to drive people to the incident command process, and then that process includes these checklists and resources to assist them. You need to be training your incident command team on the functions and responsibilities. There need to be backups in place. You can't just rely on one person to be your PR person, for example. If that person's on vacation, if that person was injured, what are you going to do? Who else can step in and take that role and knows what needs to be done? Where do they find that information? Where do they get those tools and resources? Lastly, train your staff and families on that incident command team process. Everyone in your building should know where they fit in that process. If I walked up to somebody in laundry, for example, and I said, so who do you report to? What's your role in this? They should be able to tell me, I fall under the building and transportation team, and I would report to whoever is in charge of building and transportation. And if needed, we would help with resident safety as well. You know, I don't know how that would look, but for everybody to know where their role fits within the incident command team, that would be my expectation, my thought of how to train them. From an additional resources standpoint, again, I've thrown a lot of information at you, and it may still be very fuzzy for you as far as how it all fits together. But there's a couple documents that I want to point you to. Number one is the FEMA Incident Command Training. This is a website that you can go to. It gives you a lot of resources on incident command. That'll make a whole lot more sense to you when you take some classes. The second one is the California Association of Healthcare Facilities. It's cafdisasterprep.com. CAHF is CAF. On there they have a sample emergency operations plan. They also have a nursing home incident command system. It's like 300 pages of all of the roles and responsibilities, checklists, resources, all kinds of stuff that you could want. They have those, I believe, in editable formats. If you can't find them for some reason, again, give us a holler. We'll be more than happy to help you. Hopefully this has been useful from a training standpoint. If there are other things that you need, would like to see, other training tools, please let us know. Here's my email. If you have questions or any thoughts or ideas, again, please reach out to us and we'd be more than happy to help you. Thank you.